Christmas Day, 1941. A gray-haired naval officer arrives at Pearl Harbor wearing a nondescript civilian suit. The base still reeks of fuel oil and burning steel. Admiral Chester Nimitz surveys a harbor filled with the sunken wreckage of the Pacific Fleet's battleship corps, having just inherited the worst military catastrophe in American history. Washington expects him to immediately purge his predecessor's disgraced staff and retreat to the safety of the West Coast. The traumatized surviving officers wait in the briefing room, fully expecting the axe to fall. Instead, Nimitz makes a highly unorthodox leadership decision that completely defies military expectations. The American strategic playbook for the Pacific lay at the bottom of the harbor, burning alongside the battleships. Across the ocean, the Imperial Japanese Navy was executing a flawlessly synchronized offensive, rapidly conquering territory from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies with overwhelming technological and numerical superiority. This is the anatomy of a military resurrection. It is not the myth of a solitary savior who single-handedly reversed the course of the war. Instead, it is a forensic breakdown of how an admiral, handed a fractured command structure and a crippled fleet, forged a radically new naval doctrine out of absolute necessity. To survive, Nimitz would have to rely heavily on exhausted salvage crews working in toxic mud, brilliant but eccentric intelligence officers, and aggressive submarine commanders. The scale of the pressure was monumental. He had to rebuild the striking power of the United States Navy from ashes, all while actively losing a massive, multi-front war on a daily basis. How did a commander, stripped of his heavy battleships, the undisputed foundation of traditional naval supremacy, transform a catastrophic defeat into an entirely new way of waging war at sea? President Franklin D. Roosevelt's decision to appoint Nimitz was, in itself, a political shockwave that severely disrupted the established American naval hierarchy. In the immediate aftermath of the December 7th catastrophe, the president ruthlessly cleared the board in the Pacific. To elevate Nimitz to commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, Roosevelt deliberately bypassed 28 more senior, highly decorated admirals. His explicit instruction to the Secretary of the Navy was blunt: tell Nimitz to get to Pearl Harbor and stay there until the war is won. But in a rigid, seniority-obsessed military culture, vaulting over nearly 36 superiors instantly painted a target on the 56-year-old admiral's back. He assumed command without the inherent institutional support a senior flag officer would traditionally expect. Surrounded by skeptical observers in Washington who were quietly waiting for him to fail, this internal vulnerability was immediately exploited by the man sitting directly above him in the chain of command, Admiral Ernest J. King. Newly appointed as the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, King was notoriously abrasive, highly intelligent, and completely unforgiving. Operating from the Navy Department on the East Coast, King viewed the Pacific as his personal strategic chessboard. He possessed a micromanaging leadership style and frequently bypassed Nimitz's authority, issuing direct tactical orders to Pacific Fleet task forces and treating his new theater commander more like a stubborn subordinate clerk than a trusted operational partner. Simultaneously, Nimitz faced a formidable institutional rival to the south, General Douglas MacArthur, having evacuated from the collapsing Philippines to Australia, commanded the newly formed Southwest Pacific area. MacArthur was a political heavyweight, deeply connected in Washington and profoundly distrustful of the Navy. He viewed naval forces primarily as a transport and artillery support service for his ground troops. MacArthur constantly lobbied the Joint Chiefs to divert ships, planes, and logistical resources away from Nimitz's Central Pacific Command to support his own heavily publicized pledge to retake the Philippines. Consequently, Nimitz found his theater geographically fractured, his authority squeezed between a domineering boss in Washington and a politically untouchable rival in Australia. But the bitter bureaucratic infighting was secondary to the catastrophic tactical reality on the water. For nearly 3 decades, American naval strategy in the Pacific had been entirely predicated on War Plan Orange. This meticulously war-gamed doctrine relied on a slow, heavily armored line of battleships steaming westward to engage the Imperial Japanese Navy in a massive Jutland-style surface artillery duel. The entire American logistical network, training pipeline, and combat mindset were built exclusively around the battleship. That doctrine was now dead, resting in the toxic, oil-slicked mud of Ford Island. Nimitz was tasked with defending an ocean that covered 1/3 of the globe, but his primary weapon system simply no longer existed. Stripped of the battle line, the Pacific Fleet's surviving inventory was terrifyingly thin. Nimitz possessed exactly 3 aircraft carriers: the Enterprise, the Lexington, and the Saratoga. Before the attack, traditional naval planners had considered carriers merely as vulnerable reconnaissance scouts for the battleships. Now, by default, these unarmored, highly flammable flat tops were America's sole offensive striking force. Beyond the carriers, Nimitz had a handful of cruisers, destroyers, and a small submarine force that was secretly crippled by defective Mark 14 torpedoes that routinely failed to detonate upon striking an enemy hull. Furthermore, every operational decision Nimitz made was strictly dictated by paralyzing logistical shortages. The fleet was rapidly bleeding resources. High-octane aviation fuel, anti-aircraft ammunition, replacement aircraft, and heavy fuel oil were severely rationed. The 2,000-mile supply line from San Francisco to Hawaii was fragile, and the 4,000-mile lifeline extending from Hawaii down to Australia was dangerously exposed. While Nimitz cataloged his meager assets, the Japanese war machine was executing a terrifyingly precise, multi-pronged offensive across the Pacific Basin. They were systematically dismantling the combined American, British, Dutch, and Australian forces. Guam and Wake Island had already fallen. The American garrison in the Philippines was trapped and starving on the Bataan Peninsula. Singapore was collapsing. The Imperial Japanese Navy was rapidly pushing south into the Bismarck Archipelago and the Solomon Islands, methodically severing the shipping lanes to permanently isolate Australia from the United States. Despite this massive strategic imbalance, the political pressure from Washington was absolute. The American public and the press were screaming for revenge. Admiral King bombarded Pearl Harbor with encrypted cables, demanding immediate, aggressive counterattacks to disrupt the Japanese timetable. But Nimitz knew a chilling mathematical truth. If he bowed to political pressure, committed his 3 precious carriers to a premature offensive, and lost them, the entire west coast of the United States would be left utterly defenseless. He was trapped in a strategic vice, expected to halt a technologically superior, rapidly advancing enemy with a shattered, traumatized staff. Facing this intense pressure from Washington to produce results with a non-existent fleet, Nimitz made his first critical move right inside the Pearl Harbor headquarters. On New Year's Eve, 1941, Nimitz gathered the surviving staff officers of his disgraced predecessor in a tense, claustrophobic briefing room. These men were psychologically shattered, fully expecting to be unceremoniously fired and scapegoated for the worst intelligence failure in American military history. As Nimitz took the floor, the room braced for a purge. Instead, he delivered an administrative shockwave. He looked at the exhausted, terrified men and calmly announced that he had complete confidence in them and that no one was being replaced. It was a massive political and psychological gamble. By refusing to clean house, Nimitz absorbed their institutional toxicity onto himself. But the move was a masterstroke of command leadership. He explicitly retained officers like Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, the fleet's brilliant but deeply scrutinized intelligence chief. By sparing Layton's career, Nimitz forged an unbreakable bond of loyalty with the exact men who understood the Pacific theater better than anyone else in Washington. He did not just save their jobs, he weaponized their survivor's guilt, turning a traumatized staff into a fiercely dedicated command team desperate for redemption. With his headquarters stabilized, Nimitz immediately discarded the instinct to curl into a defensive posture. Conventional naval wisdom dictated that he should hoard his few surviving ships to shield the California coast. Nimitz did the exact opposite. First, he authorized a ruthless campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare. Operating in total secrecy, American submarines were ordered to aggressively hunt down the Japanese merchant logistics network, striking the vulnerable supply arteries that fed the enemy's rapidly expanding empire. But submarines were invisible to the public and to Washington. Nimitz needed a highly visible, aggressive, kinetic action to break the paralyzing defeatism gripping the Navy. Against the terrified advice of conservative strategists, he authorized immediate hit-and-run strikes using his most irreplaceable assets, the aircraft carriers. In February 1942, American task forces pushed deep into hostile waters to launch lightning raids against Japanese island outposts in the Marshalls and Gilberts. The military risk was astronomical. If a Japanese submarine or land-based bomber wing had managed to sink even one of those flat tops, Nimitz would have lost a third of his entire striking power in a meaningless skirmish. Tactically, the raids were a localized nuisance. The bombs inflicted minimal physical damage on Japanese installations and did absolutely nothing to slow their strategic advance across the South Pacific. But psychologically, the strikes were a devastating earthquake. They decisively shattered the paralysis within the American command, proving that the Pacific Fleet could still throw a punch. More importantly, the smoke rising from those distant atolls sent a chilling message directly to Tokyo. It forced the Japanese High Command to realize that the United States Navy was not dead, but remained a highly lethal, active threat, a realization that immediately triggered a frantic and fateful escalation. The smoke rising from those distant atolls forced the Japanese High Command to suddenly recalculate. But to sustain this level of psychological warfare, Nimitz had to fundamentally rewrite the architectural blueprint of the United States Navy. Before December 1941, the battleship was the undisputed sovereign of the sea. Fleet admirals had built their entire careers around the heavy gun line. Aircraft carriers were considered fragile scouts, and submarines were viewed as coastal defense novelties. Now, standing amidst the wreckage of that old doctrine, Nimitz institutionalized a radical reversal. He explicitly designated the aircraft carrier as the primary offensive weapon of the Pacific Fleet. This was not a sudden flash of visionary genius. It was a cold, brutal calculation of survival. The surviving older battleships stationed on the West Coast consumed massive quantities of heavy fuel oil and simply could not keep pace with the 30-knot carriers. Nimitz pragmatically sidelined them. He built his new strike groups entirely around the unarmored flat tops, escorted by fast cruisers and destroyers. Simultaneously, he unleashed the submarine force. He ordered his boat commanders to wage unrestricted warfare, targeting the Japanese merchant marine. This was a stark violation of pre-war naval treaties, utilizing the exact same tactics the United States had publicly condemned Germany for employing in the Atlantic. But Nimitz recognized that the Japanese Empire was a sprawling, disconnected island network that relied absolutely on imported oil, rubber, and iron ore. To strangle the empire, the civilian logistical ships had to sink. But writing a new doctrine on paper was meaningless if the ships could not sail. Nimitz's most critical and least glamorous battlefield was the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard. While the American public demanded immediate vengeance, Nimitz spent his days agonizing over dry dock schedules, welding supplies, and heavy fuel oil reserves. He placed his faith in Captain Homer N. Wallen, the fleet salvage officer. Wallen's crews were operating in a literal toxic wasteland. The waters of Pearl Harbor were choked with millions of gallons of thick, crude bunker oil, unexploded ordnance, and shattered steel. In this hazardous environment, civilian shipyard workers and Navy divers worked grueling 24-hour shifts. They were not just clearing wreckage, they were performing daily miracles of industrial resurrection. When a carrier returned from a raid with structural damage or blown catapults, the shipyard did not have weeks to fix her. They had days. Nimitz deliberately bypassed standard Navy procurement bureaucracy, granting the yard commanders unprecedented authority to scavenge parts, cannibalize the sunken battleships, and force-feed repairs to the active fleet. It was a terrifyingly fragile system. If a single aircraft carrier suffered severe battle damage, there were no replacements coming from American shipyards for at least another year. Every time Nimitz sent a task force out of the harbor, He was gambling with the only capital ships standing between the Imperial Japanese Navy and the coast of California. To mitigate this astronomical military risk, Nimitz desperately needed to see through the fog of war. He needed actionable intelligence. Down in the basement of the 14th Naval District Administration Building at Pearl Harbor, behind heavy steel doors and armed Marine guards, sat the Combat Intelligence Unit, heavily classified and known as Station HYPO. It was a windowless, airless dungeon. Inside, a team of eccentric, chronically sleep-deprived cryptanalysts and linguists worked in agonizing conditions to break the primary Japanese naval code, designated JN-25. The unit was commanded by Commander Joseph Rochefort, a brilliant, highly unconventional officer. Rochefort routinely worked 20-hour shifts, wearing a red smoking jacket and carpet slippers to combat the basement chill, surviving on black coffee and sheer nervous energy. His team was attempting to solve a mathematical nightmare. The Japanese code involved tens of thousands of 5-digit groups, constantly altered by a secondary additive book. It was an intellectual meat grinder. But Rochefort's biggest threat did not just come from Tokyo. It came directly from Washington, D.C. The Central Navy Intelligence Office, OP-20G, viewed Rochefort's Pearl Harbor team as rogue, undisciplined amateurs. Washington bureaucrats repeatedly ordered HYPO to stop trying to crack the operational fleet codes and instead focus on low-level logistical traffic. They demanded strict centralization of all cryptographic efforts on the East Coast. This is where Nimitz made one of the most consequential command decisions of the early war. Instead of bowing to the Washington hierarchy, he deliberately shielded Rochefort. Nimitz, guided by his trusted intelligence chief Edwin Layton, recognized a fundamental truth. The men physically sitting in the Pacific, breathing the air of the theater and tracking the enemy's operational tempo, were vastly better positioned to interpret the disjointed fragments of intercepted radio traffic. Nimitz threw his 4-star weights squarely in front of HYPO. He aggressively fended off Washington's bureaucratic interference and explicitly ordered Rochefort to ignore the East Coast and keep hunting the primary Japanese naval code. He gave the eccentric cryptanalysts the two things they needed most: uninterrupted time and absolute top cover. While Rochefort wrestled with the mathematics of JN-25, Nimitz was actively fighting a vicious bureaucratic war on two fronts. Admiral Ernest King, commanding from the Navy Department in Washington, possessed a relentless, almost manic drive for offensive action. King read the map of the Pacific, but rarely calculated the agonizing logistical math required to cross it. He bombarded Pearl Harbor with encrypted teleprinter messages, demanding that Nimitz commit his precious carriers to deep penetration strikes against heavily fortified Japanese island strongholds. King wanted a decisive, punishing blow to satisfy the press and the politicians. Nimitz knew that sending his fragile carriers into confined waters covered by land-based Japanese bombers without adequate fuel reserves was strategic suicide. So, Nimitz weaponized logistics. When King demanded an aggressive attack, Nimitz responded with cold, irrefutable data. He sent detailed replies outlining the exact fuel consumption rates of the escort destroyers, the limited turnaround capacity of the slow fleet oilers, and the precise mathematical impossibility of keeping a task force on station for the duration King requested. It was a masterclass in managing a hostile superior. Nimitz did not directly refuse orders. He simply presented the physical limitations of reality, forcing Washington to acknowledge that steel ships could not run on aggressive intentions alone. Simultaneously, Nimitz had to fend off General Douglas MacArthur in the Southwest Pacific. MacArthur viewed the Navy's carriers essentially as a dedicated transport and artillery service for his own ambitions. He aggressively lobbied the War Department to transfer Nimitz's ships under his direct command to support a sweeping ground push through the islands north of Australia. MacArthur possessed a massive public relations machine and powerful political allies in Congress. To counter this immense gravitational pull, Nimitz relied on the quiet, pragmatic support of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to maintain his independence, arguing relentlessly that stripping the Central Pacific of its carrier strike force would allow the Japanese to sever the primary logistical lifeline extending from San Francisco to Hawaii. Nimitz was essentially fighting three wars simultaneously, one against the Imperial Japanese Navy, one against the impatient aggression of Washington, and one against the political ego of Douglas MacArthur. Across the ocean, the Imperial Japanese Navy watched this American reorganization with a mixture of confusion and growing anxiety. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, was a pragmatist who deeply understood American industrial capacity and deeply feared an extended war of attrition. Immediately following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese state propaganda celebrated the total annihilation of the American Pacific Fleet. The Japanese High Command fully expected the surviving American forces to cower in Hawaii, paralyzed by fear and lacking the heavy battleships necessary to project power across the Pacific Basin. But the intelligence intercepts landing on Yamamoto's desk told a deeply unsettling story. American radio traffic was highly disciplined, yet Japanese listening posts kept catching fleeting, phantom transmissions, indicating that the American aircraft carriers were not sitting in port. They were actively moving. The hit-and-run raids on the Marshall and Gilbert Islands shattered the comfortable illusion of a pacified enemy. The American carriers were refusing to fight a traditional, predictable naval war. They were operating as rogue strike forces, appearing out of the vast ocean, delivering a localized punch and vanishing before heavy Japanese surface units could vector in and respond. This erratic, highly mobile American strategy deeply frustrated Japanese strategic planners. They possessed the largest, most technologically advanced fleet on the planet, heavily armored, and eager for a decisive, war-ending battle of annihilation. But they could not destroy an enemy they could not catch. This simmering anxiety within the Japanese High Command erupted into full-blown strategic panic in April 1942. The triggering event was not a massive fleet engagement, but a psychological strike of unprecedented audacity. Under absolute secrecy, Nimitz authorized the carrier USS Hornet to sail deep into the hostile waters of the Western Pacific. Lashed to her wooden flight deck were 16 Army Air Force B-25 Mitchell medium bombers, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle. It was a highly experimental joint operation that violated every established rule of naval aviation. Land-based bombers had never been launched from an aircraft carrier at sea. They were entirely too heavy, their wingspans were too wide, and the required takeoff rolls were too long for a standard flight deck. But through brutal, stripped-down weight reduction and the exploitation of extreme headwind launches, it was deemed mathematically possible. The Hornet, escorted by the Enterprise, penetrated to within 700 miles of the Japanese home islands. When spotted by a civilian Japanese picket boat, they were forced to launch early to avoid destruction. 16 heavy bombers roared off the pitching deck and flew directly toward Tokyo, Yokohama, and Kobe. Militarily, the Doolittle raid was a pinprick. The scattered bomb load of 16 medium bombers dropped across major industrial centers caused negligible physical damage to the massive Japanese war machine. But the psychological and political blast radius was catastrophic. For centuries, the Japanese populace had been assured by their militaristic government that the home islands were sacred, inviolable, and completely protected by the emperor and the military. Suddenly, in broad daylight, American bombs were detonating in the heart of the capital. The humiliation for the Japanese military establishment, and particularly for the Imperial Japanese Navy, was absolute. They had completely failed in their primary, sacred duty to protect the emperor from foreign assault. The Doolittle raid instantly resolved every lingering strategic debate within the Japanese High Command. Before April, Japanese planners were bitterly divided on their next operational move. Some factions wanted to push west into the Indian Ocean. Others wanted to drive south to permanently sever the supply lines to Australia. But the sight of American bombers flying over Tokyo abruptly terminated those discussions. Admiral Yamamoto now possessed the absolute political leverage he needed to force his own highly controversial strategy through the Naval General Staff. He argued that the American aircraft carriers were a chaotic, unpredictable threat that had to be eliminated immediately and at all costs. As long as those flat tops existed, the Japanese homeland remained fundamentally vulnerable. Yamamoto devised an immensely complex, multi-pronged offensive designed to lure the remnants of the American Pacific Fleet into a final, decisive ambush. He would push his massive carrier strike force into the Central Pacific, threatening an objective so vital that Nimitz would have absolutely no choice but to commit his precious carriers to defend it. This delicate balancing act of carrier raids and cracked codes was violently tested when the Japanese finally launched a massive counterthrust. The terrifying cost of Nimitz's aggressive reliance on carrier warfare became brutally apparent in early May 1942 when American task forces intercepted a Japanese thrust toward Australia in the Coral Sea. The strategic price of stopping the enemy advance was catastrophic. The massive aircraft carrier USS Lexington was gutted by internal explosions and slipped beneath the waves. Suddenly, Nimitz's already fragile striking power was slashed. He was left with exactly 2 fully operational aircraft carriers in the Pacific to face an elite Japanese fleet that fielded over half a dozen heavy flat tops. As the battered American remnants retreated toward Hawaii, an even greater crisis erupted inside the windowless basement of Station HYPO. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his exhausted cryptanalysts had intercepted fragments of Yamamoto's impending retaliatory ambush. They explicitly warned Nimitz that a massive enemy armada was preparing to strike a target designated in Japanese radio traffic as AF. Rochefort's team was absolutely certain AF meant Midway Atoll, a tiny but vital outpost guarding the direct approach to Pearl Harbor. But the Central Intelligence apparatus in Washington vehemently rejected this assessment. Analysts on the East Coast insisted the real target was the Aleutian Islands, the South Pacific, or the Californian coast. They dismissed Rochefort's warnings as the panicked guesswork of a disgraced local staff, the exact same men who had failed to predict the Pearl Harbor disaster just 5 months earlier. Washington strongly advised Nimitz not to fall for what they believed was an obvious Japanese deception. Nimitz was cornered. If he followed Washington's conservative advice and ignored his local intelligence, Midway would fall and Hawaii would be hopelessly exposed. But if he trusted Rochefort and committed his last operational carriers to the wrong grid, the Pacific Fleet would be permanently annihilated, leaving the American West Coast utterly defenseless. He was forced to bet the entire survival of the United States Navy on a sleep-deprived team of codebreakers dealing in partial mathematics. And with the Imperial Japanese Navy already steaming eastward across the Pacific to spring their trap, Nimitz had to make the most agonizing command decision of the war. Nimitz did not hesitate. He chose to trust the men in his basement over the bureaucrats in Washington. To settle the debate permanently, he authorized a simple, brilliant ruse. Midway transmitted a fake, unencrypted radio message complaining of a broken water distillation plant. 2 days later, American listening posts intercepted a Japanese dispatch reporting that target AF was short of water. The trap was confirmed. Nimitz immediately ordered his 2 operational aircraft carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, to steam north and prepare an ambush. But 2 flight decks were not enough to stop Admiral Yamamoto's massive 4-carrier strike force. Nimitz desperately needed a 3rd. On May 27th, the USS Yorktown limped into Pearl Harbor dry dock, trailing oil and bearing severe structural damage from the Coral Sea. Navy engineers inspected the warped bulkheads and shattered flight deck, estimating that repairs would require at least 3 months in a West Coast shipyard. Nimitz walked the damaged deck himself, looked at the yard commanders, and gave them exactly 72 hours. It was an industrial demand bordering on madness, but the civilian workers and Navy repair crews delivered. Welding arcs burned around the clock in a continuous, blinding glare. 3 days later, Yorktown sailed out of the channel, taking repair crews still fixing her internal wiring with her. In a single, ruthless stroke of administrative willpower, Nimitz had just increased his striking power by a 3rd. Before the ships vanished over the horizon, Nimitz handed tactical command to Admiral Raymond Spruance with a highly specific, defining operational order. It was a doctrine of calculated risk. Spruance was instructed not to expose his fragile force to superior enemy strength unless the prospect of inflicting greater damage was absolute. Nimitz was sending a numerically inferior, deeply scarred fleet into a blind interception, relying entirely on invisible radio waves and the mathematics of a broken code. On the morning of June 4, 1942, the trap snapped shut. The resulting clash was not a masterpiece of synchronized naval maneuvering. The initial American airstrikes were disjointed, desperate, and uncoordinated, throwing obsolete aircraft against the untouched veteran might of the Japanese carrier screen. The battle hung by a terrifyingly thin thread, driven by pilot exhaustion, fuel starvation, and pure operational friction. Yet, because Nimitz had positioned his forces precisely where the intelligence dictated, the American squadrons eventually found the Japanese flat tops at their most vulnerable moment. In the span of just 5 minutes, the fundamental balance of naval power in the Pacific was violently overturned. When the thick black smoke finally cleared over the burning ocean, it revealed a strategic landscape that had been permanently altered. The 4 shattered hulls of the Japanese heavy carriers resting at the bottom of the Pacific validated the most agonizing gamble of Nimitz's command. But the stunning tactical victory at Midway was merely the physical manifestation of a much deeper organizational triumph. This battle was not won solely in those chaotic 5 minutes of dive bombing. It was won over the preceding 6 months in the toxic mud of the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard and the claustrophobic basement of Station HYPO. When Nimitz first arrived in that nondescript civilian suit, the destruction of the battleship line was viewed as a terminal catastrophe. In reality, it was a brutal but necessary catalyst. Stripped of their slow-moving dreadnoughts, the United States Navy was violently forced to modernize, decades ahead of schedule. The loss of the heavy gun line erased years of rigid, battleship-obsessed dogma, leaving a vacuum that could only be filled by the highly mobile warfare of the aircraft carrier and the unrestricted hunting of the submarine force. Nimitz engineered this transformation by utilizing the exact people Washington wanted to discard. By refusing to purge his disgraced predecessor's staff, he weaponized the institutional memory of officers desperate for redemption. By actively shielding eccentric cryptanalysts from East Coast bureaucratic interference, he turned fragmented mathematics into actionable, lethal intelligence. And by granting unprecedented authority to civilian repair crews and salvage divers, he forged an industrial logistics chain capable of sustaining an entirely new doctrine of naval combat. Chester Nimitz did not single-handedly rescue the Pacific Fleet from the ashes of December 7th. He did something far more permanent. He engineered the exact psychological and administrative environment where a traumatized, shattered command could aggressively adapt, rebuild its own strategic blueprint, and ultimately save itself. The soft-spoken admiral, who had initially arrived at Pearl Harbor in a nondescript civilian suit, inherited nothing but a graveyard of sunken battleships and a paralyzed command structure. Yet by defying Washington and trusting the exact officers he was explicitly told to purge, Chester Nimitz did far more than simply salvage a broken navy. Out of the toxic oil slicks of that devastating December, he stripped away decades of obsolete dogma and ultimately forged the most lethal, highly mobile, carrier-centric armada in human history, forever changing not just the Pacific theater, but the fundamental nature of modern naval warfare.